The summer of 1859 settled over Willowbrook Plantation like a funeral shroud, heavy, suffocating and thick with the promise of something terrible. The air itself seemed to rot in the Mississippi heat, clinging to skin and lungs, making every breath taste of copper and despair. Eleanor Carter stood on the second-floor balcony of the main house, her pale fingers wrapped around a glass of sweetened tea that had long since gone warm. Below her, the cotton fields stretched endlessly toward a horizon blurred by humidity and suffering. Somewhere in that expanse of white bowls and broken backs, a man was being whipped. She could hear the crack of leather against flesh, followed by a scream that died quickly, choked off perhaps, or simply surrendered to inevitability. She didn't flinch. Not anymore. Eleanor had been raised differently. Born in New Orleans to a family of moderate means, she'd been educated by French tutors, taught to read Voltaire and debate philosophy over wine that cost more than most men earned in a month. Her mother had been a Creole beauty who'd instilled in her daughter a dangerous combination, refinement and conscience. Her father, a merchant with abolitionist leanings he kept carefully hidden, had shown her that cruelty wasn't natural. It was a choice. But choices, Eleanor had learned, were luxuries afforded only to those with power. She'd met Richard Carter at a ball in Natchez when she was 19. He was 43, silver-haired, commanding, and draped in the wealth that came from owning 117 human beings. He'd courted her with the calculated precision of a man acquiring property, and her parents, struggling with debts they'd never mentioned, had encouraged the match with smiles that never reached their eyes. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The wedding had been beautiful. The marriage had been a slow-motion burial. Richard Carter was a man who believed in order. Order maintained through fear, order enforced with iron and rope, and the knowledge that no one, not the law, not God, not his young wife, would stop him. In the 7 years since their wedding, Eleanor had watched him break men for sport, separate families for profit, and orchestrate punishments so sadistic that even other plantation owners whispered about them over brandy, and she had said nothing, because what could she say? She was a woman in Mississippi. Her husband owned her as surely as he owned the people in the quarters. The only difference was that her chains were made of silk and social convention rather than iron. But silence, Eleanor was beginning to understand, was its own kind of poison. It accumulated in the blood, drop by drop, until one day you woke up and realized you'd become complicit in every horror you'd witnessed. The whipping below had stopped. Eleanor set down her tea and moved back inside, where the air was marginally cooler and smelled of beeswax and lies. The house was a monument to stolen labor. Every polished floorboard, every crystal chandelier, every velvet curtain had been paid for in blood and agony. Sometimes she felt like she was living inside a beautiful corpse. Mrs. Carter. The voice was soft, hesitant. Eleanor turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her thin cotton dress. Lily was 16, with skin the color of mahogany, and eyes that had learned too young to hide everything that mattered. She'd been Eleanor's maid for 2 years, assigned by Richard, because he believed a lady needed attending. What he didn't know, what Eleanor had been careful to conceal, was that in those 2 years, Lily had become the closest thing to a friend Eleanor had in this house of horrors. They didn't speak of freedom. They didn't dare. But Eleanor had taught Lily to read, meeting in secret after Richard had drunk himself into his nightly stupor. She'd shared books, whispered stories of places where people didn't own each other, planted seeds of a world that existed beyond Willowbrook's suffocating borders. "What is it, Lily?" The girl's voice trembled. "The master says you're to come down for dinner. Says he has business to discuss." Something in Lily's tone made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "What kind of business?" Lily's eyes flicked up briefly, and in that moment Eleanor saw terror so pure it seemed to stop time. "He's been drinking since noon, ma'am, and he's been watching me." The words landed like stones in dark water, sending ripples of understanding through Eleanor's chest. She knew that look in Richard's eyes, had seen it directed at others. That particular glaze of alcohol and entitlement that turned human beings into objects, obstacles, or amusements depending on his mood. "Go to the kitchen," Eleanor said quietly. "Stay with Martha. Don't come back upstairs tonight no matter what you hear." "But ma'am, if the master calls for me, I'll handle Richard." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. "Go. Now." Lily fled, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Eleanor watched her disappear down the servants' stairs, then turned to her wardrobe. She selected a dress of deep burgundy. Richard preferred her in dark colors, said they made her look like a portrait worth owning, and began the mechanical process of making herself presentable for dinner with a monster. Downstairs, the dining room gleamed with silver and crystal, a stage set for civility. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, already on his fourth glass of whiskey. His face had the florid, swollen look of a man who'd spent decades marinating in alcohol and rage. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Come, sit. I have wonderful news." Eleanor took her place at the opposite end of the table, a geography of 12 feet that felt both too far and not nearly far enough. An enslaved woman named Sarah brought out the first course, turtle soup that Eleanor knew she wouldn't be able to swallow. "Wonderful news," she prompted, her voice carefully neutral. Richard leaned back in his chair, savoring his moment. "I've been invited to join the Natchez Agricultural Society. They want me to speak about my methods, my efficiency." He smiled, and Eleanor felt her skin crawl. "They're calling me a model for the future of Southern prosperity." "How commendable." "Indeed." He took another drink. "Of course, they'll want to tour the plantation. See the operation firsthand, which means everything must be perfect. I've already ordered new clothes for the house staff. Can't have them looking shabby." He paused, his eyes finding Eleanor across the distance. "And I've decided that girl of yours, Lily, she's wasted on maid work. Pretty thing like that. I'm thinking she'd be better suited to other duties." The room seemed to contract. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her soup spoon until the metal hurt her palm. "What duties?" Her voice was ice. Richard's smile widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Come now, Eleanor, don't play naive. You know how these things work. A man has needs, and you've been distant lately." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt something ancient and terrible unfurling in her chest, a rage so profound it felt geological, tectonic, a shifting of plates that had been grinding against each other for 7 years. "She's 16 years old, Richard. Old enough." He shrugged. "Besides, what does it matter? She's property. I can do with my property as I please." Eleanor set down her spoon with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost conversational. "If you touch her, I will kill you." Richard blinked, then laughed, a booming, condescending sound. "My dear, you're being dramatic. This is how things are done, how they've always been done. You're a smart woman. Surely you understand that." "I understand perfectly." Eleanor stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I understand that you're a monster who believes power gives you permission. I understand that you've built your fortune on the broken bodies of people whose names you don't even know. And I understand that I've been a coward for allowing it to continue." The laughter died in Richard's throat. His expression darkened, alcohol-fueled amusement curdling into something dangerous. He stood as well, swaying slightly. "You forget yourself, woman. You forget who owns this house, who owns everything in it, including you." "Perhaps." Eleanor's smile was cold as December. "But you've forgotten something too, husband. You've forgotten that silent women are often the most dangerous ones, because we watch, We learn. We wait. Richard took a step toward her, hand raised. You need a reminder of your place. The door burst open. Thomas, the overseer, stood panting in the entrance, his face ashen. Colonel Carter, sir. There's been an incident in the West Fields. 3 of the men have run. We need dogs. We need... Richard's attention snapped away from Eleanor, fury redirecting toward this new problem. Get the dogs. Get the men. I want them found before sunrise, or you'll take their punishment yourself. As Richard stormed out, shouting orders into the humid night, Eleanor stood alone in the dining room. The candles flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move with intention. Outside, dogs began to bark. Men shouted. The machinery of oppression ground into motion, but Eleanor didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her mind racing through calculations, possibilities, consequences. She thought of Lily, hiding in the kitchen. She thought of the 117 souls Richard claimed to own. She thought of 7 years of silence, and she thought of the keys. Richard always kept them on his belt, keys to the supply sheds, the smokehouse, the locked rooms where he kept instruments of punishment. And one more. A key he thought no one else knew about, the key to the slave quarters, the one he used when he wanted to make examples, to separate families, to remind everyone who held absolute power. Eleanor moved to the window and watched her husband disappear into the darkness, followed by men with torches and dogs. The hunt would take hours. He'd drink more, he'd rage more, and eventually, stumbling and furious, he'd return. By then, Eleanor knew she would be ready, because silence, she'd learned, had its limits, and she'd finally reached hers. The night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance someone was screaming, but Eleanor didn't flinch, not anymore. Instead, she smiled, her expression that would have terrified anyone who saw it, and began to plan. The Carters had ruled Willowbrook for 3 generations. That reign was about to end. The manhunt stretched into the small hours of morning, transforming Willowbrook into a landscape of fire and fury. Eleanor watched from the darkened parlor as torches moved like angry fireflies through the cotton fields, heard the distant baying of bloodhounds mixed with men's shouts and the occasional crack of gunfire meant to intimidate rather than kill. Richard wanted his property returned intact. Damaged goods could still work, but dead ones were a total loss. She'd dismissed the house staff hours ago, claiming a headache. Now she sat alone in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, waiting with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for 7 years. The grandfather clock in the hall marked each minute with mechanical precision, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to revolutions brewing in the hearts of silent women. Around 3 in the morning, she heard them coming back. Men's voices, rough with exhaustion and failure. The dogs sounded different now, tired, defeated. They hadn't found the runaways. Somewhere in the swamps and bayous of Mississippi, 3 men were racing toward a freedom that might kill them, but was still preferable to what they'd left behind. The front door crashed open. Richard's boots thundered across the foyer, followed by the overseer's more cautious tread. "Useless," Richard's voice carried through the house, slurred and savage. "All of you! $3,000 worth of property vanished into the night and you couldn't track them. Sir, the rain washed out the scent. The dogs lost the trail at the river. I don't want excuses, Thomas. I want results. Tomorrow we double the patrols. I want every road watched, every sympathizer questioned, and I want the rest of them reminded what happens to runners." Eleanor heard Thomas mumble agreement and then retreat. Richard's footsteps continued, unsteady, moving toward his study. She heard a decanter clink against glass, the glug of whiskey being poured with the desperate liberality of a man trying to drown his rage. She waited. An hour passed. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. Wood contracting, wind against shutters, the whisper of a building keeping secrets. Finally, Eleanor rose and moved silently through the darkened rooms toward Richard's study. She found him slumped in his leather chair, an empty decanter on the desk beside him, his mouth open in an alcohol-stupid sleep that was indistinguishable from unconsciousness. His shirt was stained with sweat and mud, his face flushed crimson even in repose. The keys hung from his belt, glinting dully in the lamplight. Eleanor studied her husband with the clinical detachment of a naturalist examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. This was the man who'd promised her father he'd provide for her, protect her, cherish her. This was the man who'd turned their marriage bed into a duty she endured and their home into a monument to cruelty. This was the man who'd threatened Lily. She thought about the girl, probably awake in the servants' quarters right now, wondering if tomorrow would be the day her world ended. Eleanor had seen it happen before. Young women whose masters decided to exercise their perceived rights, their lives reduced to trauma and survival, their futures obliterated before they'd truly begun. Not this time. Eleanor's hands were steady as she reached for the keys. Richard stirred slightly, muttering something incomprehensible, but didn't wake. The alcohol had done its work. She unhooked the ring from his belt, metal clicking softly against metal, and stepped back. The keys felt heavier than they should, weighted with 7 years of suppressed rage and newly discovered purpose. Eleanor turned them over in her palm, identifying each one: smokehouse, tool shed, punishment room. And there, smaller than the others, darker with age, the key to the slave quarters. "Eleanor?" Richard's voice, thick and confused, made her freeze. His eyes opened to bleary slits, struggling to focus. "What are you doing?" She met his gaze, and something in her expression must have penetrated even his drunken haze, because his confusion began shifting toward alarm. "Getting some air," she said quietly. "You should sleep, Richard. You've had a difficult night. The keys." His hand fumbled toward his belt, found it empty, and his eyes widened. "Give them back." "No." The word hung between them, simple and absolute. Richard tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, and he collapsed back into the chair. "Eleanor, I'm warning you. You're warning me." Her voice was silk over steel. "That's interesting, because I've been wanting to warn you about something too. About what happens when you push someone too far, when you mistake silence for permission, when you confuse power with immunity." Richard's face darkened with rage, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He was trapped in the chair by his own excess, by years of believing nothing could touch him. "You're insane. I'm done." Eleanor moved toward the door, the keys clutched in her hand. "I'm done watching, done pretending, done being complicit in your monstrous little kingdom. If you walk out that door, I swear to God, you'll what?" She turned back and her smile was terrible. "Beat me? You've already done that. Lock me away? I'm already in a prison of silk and silver. Kill me? At this point, Richard, that might be a mercy." She watched him struggle, watched understanding dawn in his alcohol-soaked brain that for the first time in their marriage, he wasn't in control. The power dynamic had shifted, and he was helpless to stop it. "Where are you going?" His voice had lost its authority, becoming almost plaintive. "To set things right." Eleanor opened the door, paused. "You know what's funny, Richard. You've spent your whole life teaching people that power is everything, that whoever holds the keys holds the world. Tonight, I'm going to teach you something in return." "What's that?" "That sometimes the powerless find power, and when they do, they remember everything." She left him there, fumbling helplessly with the arms of his chair, his shouts following her down the hallway, but growing weaker as distance and whiskey conspired to steal his voice. Eleanor didn't look back. She moved through the house with purpose, through rooms built on suffering, toward a reckoning 7 years in the making. The night air hit her like baptism when she stepped outside. The sky was beginning to lighten along the eastern horizon. Not quite dawn, but the promise of it, that liminal time when darkness and day negotiate their boundaries. Eleanor crossed the yard toward the quarters, her white nightgown ghostly in the pre-dawn gloom. The slave quarters at Willowbrook were a row of wooden cabins, each housing multiple families in conditions Richard considered adequate because they kept people alive enough to work. Eleanor had been inside them twice in 7 years, both times to deliver medicine during illness outbreaks. The smell of too many bodies in too little space, the sound of children crying from hunger, the sight of people trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. These memories had haunted her dreams. Now she stood before the main cabin, the key cold in her hand. From inside, she could hear breathing, restless sleep, someone coughing. These people had no idea what was about to happen. How could they? Eleanor herself barely understood the full implications of what she was planning. She was about to knock when a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Carter." Eleanor turned to find Lily emerging from the shadows, wrapped in a thin shawl. The girl's eyes were swollen. She'd been crying, but her spine was straight, her chin raised. "You shouldn't be here," Eleanor said softly. "Neither should you, Mom." Lily glanced at the keys in Eleanor's hand. "But here we both are." They stood in the darkness, two women separated by law and custom and the color of their skin, yet connected by something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to be property in a world owned by men like Richard Carter. "He's going to come after you," Lily whispered. "When he sobers up, when he realizes what you've done, he'll kill you." "I know." Eleanor's voice was calm. "But some things are worth dying for." "Like what?" Eleanor looked at the girl she'd taught to read, this 16-year-old who should have been worried about dances and courtship instead of whether her master would rape her tomorrow. She thought about the 117 people locked in these cabins every night, their lives determined by the whims of a man who viewed them as livestock. "Like making sure you're free," Eleanor said simply. "Like making sure all of you are free." Lily's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor didn't answer directly. Instead, she held up the keys and spoke in a voice that barely carried over the night wind. "When the sun rises, I want you to gather everyone. Tell them to be ready to run. Tell them I'm giving them a choice, the first real choice most of them have ever had. A choice to stay and continue living as property, or to leave right now with whatever they can carry and whatever head start I can give them. But the patrols, the dogs, will be otherwise occupied." Eleanor's smile was grim. "I promise you that." Lily stared at her, this white woman who'd been born into privilege and was about to throw it all away. Why? Why risk everything for people you don't even know? Eleanor thought about that question for a long moment. The true answer was complex, part guilt, part rage, part a fundamental belief that the society she'd been born into was poisoned from its foundations. But she settled for the simpler truth. "Because I've been silent too long, and silence makes us accomplices." She pressed the keys into Lily's hands. The girl looked down at them, trembling as if they might burn her skin. "What about you, Mom? I have one more thing to do." Eleanor turned back toward the main house, where Richard was probably still struggling to rise from his chair, his kingdom crumbling while he sat helpless. "One last lesson to teach your former master." Mrs. Carter," Lily's voice cracked. "Eleanor, you don't have to do this. Whatever you're planning—" "Yes," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I do. Because if I don't, who will? And if not now, when?" She touched Lily's cheek with unexpected tenderness. "You're smart, Lily. Smarter than this place ever gave you credit for. Use those keys, free your family, run north, west, anywhere but here. And when you're safe, if you're safe, remember that not everyone who looked like me was your enemy." She left before Lily could respond, walking back toward the house with the deliberate steps of someone approaching their own execution or apotheosis, perhaps both at once. Behind her, she heard Lily moving toward the quarters, heard the soft knock on doors, heard the whisper of voices beginning to rise like a tide. Inside, Richard had managed to stand and was leaning against his desk, face purple with rage and humiliation. He looked up as Eleanor entered, and his expression twisted into something ugly. "You traitorous bitch, you gave them the keys." "I did. I'll have you committed. I'll tell everyone you've gone mad. You'll do nothing," Eleanor said calmly, "because you're about to be far too busy to worry about me." She moved to the liquor cabinet and poured him another drink, a generous amount of whiskey in a crystal glass. She carried it to him, held it out. Richard stared at it suspiciously. "What is this?" "Exactly what it looks like. Drink, Richard. You've had a terrible night. You're exhausted, drunk, and in a few hours, 117 pieces of your property are going to be missing. You'll need your strength for what comes next." "You've ruined me," he snarled, but he took the glass, his addiction stronger than his suspicion. "No," Eleanor corrected, watching him drain it. "You ruined yourself. I'm just making sure everyone knows it." She waited while the whiskey did its work, adding to the substantial amount already in his system. Richard's eyes began to glaze, his movements becoming less coordinated. When he tried to set down the glass, he missed the desk entirely, and it shattered on the floor. "What did you—" His words slurred beyond comprehension. "I didn't poison you, if that's what you're thinking. I didn't need to." Eleanor caught him as he stumbled, guided him toward the door. He was heavy, barely conscious, all that masculine power reduced to dead weight. "I just needed you helpless, and drunk men are already halfway there." She half-dragged, half-carried him across the yard. The first fingers of dawn were touching the sky now, painting everything in shades of blood and promise. From the quarters came voices, no longer whispered, but rising, excited, terrified, hopeful. People were waking up to a choice they'd never imagined having. Eleanor brought Richard to the quarter's main door. With effort, she propped him against the frame, then stepped back. He was semi-conscious, mumbling threats that meant nothing anymore. She studied him one final time. This man who'd owned her body, claimed her future, determined every aspect of her life for 7 years. "You're going to teach them something, Richard," she said quietly. "You're going to teach them what justice looks like when the powerless finally get power. And I'm going to watch." She stepped inside the quarters, faces turned toward her, shocked, confused, afraid, men and women who'd been woken by Lily's news, who couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Eleanor saw fear in their eyes, but also something else, a hunger, an ancient rage that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "This man," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart, "this man who you've called master, who's beaten you, starved you, sold your children and stolen your lives, he's yours now. Do with him what you think justice demands." The silence that followed was profound. Richard, barely conscious, seemed to sense the shift in the air. His eyes opened slightly, struggling to focus on the faces surrounding him. "Eleanor," his voice was small, suddenly vulnerable. "Eleanor, what have you done?" But Eleanor was already backing toward the door. She met Lily's eyes across the cabin, and the girl nodded once, a gesture of understanding, perhaps of forgiveness, certainly of acknowledgement. "What justice demands," Eleanor repeated. Then she stepped outside, closed the door, and with the spare key Lily had given her, locked it from the outside. The screaming started almost immediately. Eleanor stood on the veranda of the main house as the sun climbed higher, transforming the Mississippi morning from gray to gold. From the slave quarters, the sounds continued, screams that rose and fell like terrible music, punctuated by thuds, crashes and voices she couldn't distinguish. She didn't move toward them, didn't try to stop what was happening. She simply stood, her white nightgown rippling in the morning breeze, and bore witness. This was justice. Brutal, raw, perhaps unforgivable by the laws of men and the dictates of civilization. But Eleanor had spent 7 years watching a different kind of brutality, dressed in the respectable clothes of property rights and social order. She'd watched Richard break human beings for sport, watched him separate mothers from children, watched him transform suffering into profit and call it progress. If God was watching, Eleanor thought, let him judge them all. She'd stopped believing in a God who allowed Willowbrook to exist years ago. Around her, the plantation was waking to chaos. She could see figures moving in the quarters, people gathering possessions, embracing loved ones, preparing for a flight into uncertainty that was still preferable to the certainty of bondage. Some looked toward the main house, toward Eleanor standing like a ghost on the veranda, and their expressions were complex tapestries of emotion she couldn't fully read. Fear, gratitude, suspicion, hope. The screaming from the locked cabin had diminished to whimpers now, then to silence. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction. Something darker and more complicated. She'd sentenced her husband to death as surely as if she'd pulled a trigger, but she'd done it by giving power to those he'd brutalized. Was that murder or justice? Revolution or crime? The door to the quarters opened. Men emerged, their faces grim, their clothes stained with blood that wasn't theirs. The eldest among them, a man named Moses, who'd been at Willowbrook longer than Eleanor had been alive, walked toward the main house. He moved slowly, his body bearing the scars of decades of violence, his eyes carrying something ancient and terrible. Eleanor descended the veranda steps to meet him halfway. They stood in the yard as the sun gained strength, two people separated by everything the world said mattered and connected by something it couldn't name. "He's dead," Moses said. His voice was rough, factual. "Took most of the night, but he's dead." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for telling me." Moses studied her face for a long moment. "You understand what you've done, Mrs. Carter, what this means." "I understand I've made myself complicit in murder. I understand the law will call it that anyway." "The law?" Moses's laugh was bitter. "The law says we're property. The law says what happened in that cabin was destruction of goods, not justice for crimes. You gonna trust the law now?" "No," Eleanor said simply. "I'm going to trust that some things are worth being damned for." Moses's expression softened slightly. "That girl, Lily. She says you taught her to read. Says you've been preparing her for something like this." "I taught her what I could. The rest she did herself. She's extraordinary." "She is." Moses looked back toward the quarters, where people were still gathering, still preparing. "Most of us, we're going to head north. Try for Ohio, maybe Canada. Some want to go west, take their chances with the wilderness. Few of the older ones, they too tired to run. They're gonna stay, tell whatever story the white folks need to hear." Eleanor understood. The ones who stayed would be questioned, possibly punished, certainly suspected. They'd have to craft a narrative that protected themselves while explaining the disappearance of over 100 people and the death of one of Mississippi's most prominent planters. "What story will they tell?" she asked. Moses's smile was grim. That Colonel Carter got drunk, went down to the quarters to make an example of someone, and the whole situation got out of hand. That by the time anybody realized what was happening, he was dead, and the others had run. That you, Mrs. Carter, were asleep in the main house and didn't know nothing until morning. That makes me innocent. A victim. "Makes you alive," Moses corrected. "We don't owe the white folks our truth. We owe ourselves our freedom. If keeping you alive helps with that, then that's the story we tell." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes for the first time that night. "Why? Why protect me? Because you, the only white person on this plantation who ever treated us like we were human. Because you gave Lily a chance at something better. Because you could have lived your whole life pretending not to see what your husband was, and instead you did something about it." Moses paused. "Might not be enough to balance the scales. Might not make you innocent. But it's something." From the quarters, Lily appeared, carrying a small bundle of possessions. She changed into traveling clothes, a simple dress, sturdy boots that Eleanor recognized as having been hers once. The girl moved toward them, her face set with determination. "We need to go," she said quietly. "Sun's getting higher. Another hour, and people gonna start noticing things ain't right." Moses nodded. "You gonna be okay, Mrs. Carter?" Eleanor looked around at Willowbrook, the fields her husband had cultivated with stolen labor, the house built on stolen lives, the empire of cruelty she'd been queen of by marriage and complicit of by silence. Soon men would come, the sheriff, the neighbors, the representatives of a society that would be far more outraged by the loss of property than by the loss of Richard Carter's miserable life. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'll face whatever comes." Lily stepped forward suddenly and embraced her, a brief, fierce hug that broke every social convention of their world. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. "Thank you," the girl whispered, "for everything, for teaching me I was worth more than what they said, for showing me that some white folks got conscience, for choosing us over him." "I should have chosen sooner," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I should have—" "You chose when you could," Lily interrupted firmly. "That's all any of us can do. Choose when we able and live with the timing we got." Moses touched Lily's shoulder. "Time to go, child." Eleanor watched them walk back to the quarters, watched as the last preparations were made. Within an hour, over 100 people began their exodus from Willowbrook, some on foot, some with horses they'd taken from Richard's stables, all moving with the desperate speed of those who know pursuit is inevitable. They scattered in different directions, a diaspora of the formerly enslaved seeking freedom in a country that would hunt them for the crime of wanting to own themselves. Eleanor stood on the veranda and watched them disappear into the Mississippi landscape, carrying nothing but hope and terror, and the knowledge that return meant death. The last to leave was Moses. He paused at the edge of the property, turned back one final time, and raised his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or acknowledgement or prayer. Eleanor raised her own hand in response. Then he was gone, and she was alone. Eleanor walked slowly back into the house. Everything looked the same, the furniture in its precise arrangements, the paintings on the walls, the silver tea service gleaming on the sideboard. But everything had changed. The house felt different, emptied not just of people, but of the particular horror that comes from building beauty on top of suffering. She went to Richard's study and began methodically destroying his records. The ledgers that tracked human beings as assets, the bills of sale that treated children as commodities, the correspondence with other planters discussing breeding programs and punishment techniques, all of it went into the fireplace. Eleanor built the fire carefully, watched the papers catch and curl, watched 7 years of meticulous record-keeping transform into ash and smoke. When the ledgers were gone, she moved to the library and selected books. Philosophy, poetry, the French novels her mother had sent her. She packed them carefully into a leather satchel, along with jewelry she could sell, documents proving her identity, and one of Richard's pistols. She didn't know if she'd have the courage to use it, but the weight of it was somehow comforting. By noon, the first visitors arrived. Thomas the overseer rode up, his face pale with panic. "Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Carter, something terrible has happened." Eleanor emerged onto the veranda, still in her nightgown, her hair deliberately disheveled. She'd practiced her expression in the mirror, shock, confusion, the appropriate amount of feminine distress. "Thomas, what's wrong?" "It's the colonel, ma'am, and the slaves. They're gone." "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "All of them, ma'am. Run off in the night. And the colonel—" Thomas swallowed hard. "We found him in the quarters. He's been killed, ma'am. Murdered." Eleanor let out a carefully calibrated scream and collapsed against the doorframe. Thomas rushed to support her, and she allowed herself to be led inside, to be given water and brandy. to play the role of the shocked widow discovering her world has collapsed. Other men arrived throughout the day. The sheriff, a portly man named Whitmore, who dined at Willowbrook a dozen times, neighbors from adjoining plantations. The county coroner. They all wanted to see the body, to examine the quarters, to understand how such a catastrophe could have occurred. Eleanor told her story in a trembling voice. She'd gone to bed early with a headache. She'd heard nothing unusual. The colonel often stayed up late drinking, and the quarters were far enough from the main house that sounds didn't carry. She'd woken to Thomas's alarm and discovered the horror. "Did you notice anything unusual about the colonel's behavior recently?" Sheriff Whitmore asked, his notebook open, his expression grave. "He'd been drinking more," Eleanor said softly. "The 3 runaways from last week had upset him terribly. He said he needed to make an example, to remind the others of their place. I begged him not to be too harsh, but he wouldn't listen." This was the genius of Moses's story. It positioned Richard as the architect of his own destruction, a man whose excessive cruelty had finally sparked the violence that killed him. It made Eleanor the innocent victim, a wife who'd tried to moderate her husband's worst impulses and failed. The men nodded sympathetically. This was a narrative they could understand, a master who'd pushed too far, property that had rebelled, a tragic but ultimately comprehensible sequence of events. It maintained the fundamental order of their world, even as it acknowledged its occasional failures. "We'll organize search parties," Whitmore said. "Get the dogs, check the river crossings, alert the patrollers in adjoining counties. With over 100 runaways, someone will have seen them." But Eleanor knew they wouldn't find them. Moses was too smart, had planned too well. The groups had scattered in multiple directions, some doubling back, some heading for swamps where dogs couldn't track, some making for underground railroad stations that existed in whispers and coded songs. Over the following days, Willowbrook transformed into a crime scene and a spectacle. White families came from miles around to view the plantation where slaves had killed their master, to cluck their tongues over the dangers of insufficient discipline, to reassure themselves that such things happened only to those who failed to maintain proper order. Eleanor played her role perfectly. The grieving widow, shocked by her husband's death, overwhelmed by the loss of property that represented her entire livelihood. She accepted condolences with appropriate gratitude, tears at appropriate moments, and cultivated an image of fragile femininity that made people want to protect her. But at night, alone in the house that felt larger and emptier with each passing hour, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the truth. She felt no grief for Richard, only a profound relief that he could hurt no one else, mixed with a terrible anticipation of what came next, because she knew this couldn't last. The story had too many holes, and she'd never been good at sustained deception. Moreover, she didn't want to spend the rest of her life pretending to mourn a monster or maintaining the fiction of her innocence. A week after Richard's death, Eleanor made her decision. She wrote letters to her parents in New Orleans, explaining nothing but saying she loved them, to a lawyer in Natchez, instructing him to sell Willowbrook and distribute the proceeds to the remaining elderly slaves who'd stayed, to Sheriff Whitmore. A letter to be opened only if she didn't return, containing the truth of what she'd done and why. Then on a moonless night, when the patrols had finally begun to relax their vigilance, Eleanor Carter packed her satchel, saddled Richard's best horse, and rode west. She didn't know where she was going, didn't have a clear plan beyond movement, distance, escape. She'd heard there were places in the territories where people didn't ask too many questions, where women could remake themselves, where the past could be buried under new names and new lives. Maybe she'd find Lily and the others. Maybe she'd start over completely, become someone else entirely. Or maybe the law would catch her, drag her back, hang her for her crimes against the social order. But as Willowbrook disappeared behind her and the Mississippi night enfolded her in darkness and possibility, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 7 years: freedom. 3 months later, Eleanor was someone else entirely. She'd stopped using the name Carter after crossing into Louisiana, too distinctive, too connected to what had happened at Willowbrook. Instead, she became Ellen Moore, a widow from Mobile whose husband had died of fever, leaving her with just enough money to travel west and start over. The story was common enough to be believable, tragic enough to discourage too many questions. She'd cut her hair short in a moment of desperation outside Shreveport, when a wanted poster bearing a sketch that looked disturbingly like her appeared outside a general store. The sketch wasn't quite right. The artist had made her face harder, older, more obviously criminal, but it was close enough to make her heart stop. She'd bought scissors from that same store, ridden to a creek, and hacked off the dark curls that had once been her vanity, watching them float away on brown water. Now she worked in a boarding house in Natchitoches, a river town where transients were common, and the proprietress, a stern French woman named Madame Bouchard, asked no questions as long as the work was done. Eleanor cleaned rooms, served meals, and kept her eyes down and her story simple. It was a nothing life, invisible and small, and for the first time in years, Eleanor could breathe. The boarding house attracted travelers of all kinds, merchants moving goods up and down the Red River, families heading west to Texas, occasional drifters with haunted eyes, and stories they never fully told. Eleanor had become skilled at reading people, at sensing danger in the set of shoulders or the tone of questions. Most guests were harmless, absorbed in their own journeys and troubles. But one evening in late November, a man arrived who made all her instincts scream warning. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of groomed appearance that spoke of money and education. He checked in under the name Harrison Webb, claiming to be a journalist from Richmond researching a story about Western expansion. But there was something about the way he watched Eleanor as she showed him to his room, something calculating in his pale eyes that made her skin crawl. "You're not from around here," he observed, his tone casual, but his attention sharp. "I detect a certain refinement in your manner. New Orleans, perhaps?" "Mobile," Eleanor said, keeping her voice flat. "I'm just here for work, sir. Will you be needing anything else?" "Not at the moment." But he didn't move aside to let her pass, and Eleanor felt the walls of the narrow hallway closing in. "Though I must say, you remind me of someone, a woman I heard about, a terrible scandal back in Mississippi." Eleanor's blood turned to ice, but her face remained neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about Mississippi, sir. Now, if you'll excuse me, Eleanor Carter." He said the name like he was testing it, watching for her reaction. "Wife of Colonel Richard Carter of Willowbrook Plantation. She disappeared the same night her husband was murdered by his slaves. Most curious thing, authorities thought she was dead. But some people who get paid to notice things, they wondered if maybe she'd run." Eleanor's hand moved toward the pocket where she'd started keeping Richard's pistol. "I don't know anyone by that name. You're mistaken." Webb smiled, and it was the smile of a cat that had just cornered a mouse. "Am I? Because the woman I'm looking for, she'd have had to change her appearance. Maybe cut that long dark hair everyone remembered. Maybe take a new name. Maybe find work somewhere she could disappear. What do you want?" The pretense dropped from his face like a mask. "What I want is the $1,000 reward the Mississippi Planters Association put up for information leading to Eleanor Carter's capture. What I want is to make a name for myself by bringing a fugitive to justice. What I want, Miss Moore, or should I say Mrs. Carter, is you." Eleanor's hand closed around the pistol. "I could shoot you right now." "You could," Webb agreed. "But Madame Bouchard would hear the shot, and then you'd have to explain why you murdered a guest in her hallway. And even if you got away, every lawman in Louisiana would be hunting you. Is that really the life you want?" He was right, and they both knew it. Eleanor's hand loosened slightly on the weapon. "What do you propose?" "Come back with me voluntarily. Face trial in Mississippi. Maybe with the right lawyer, the right story, you could claim duress, temporary insanity, anything. You're a woman, after all. Juries can be sympathetic to ladies in distress, Eleanor almost laughed. Sympathetic enough to forgive helping slaves murder their master. You don't believe that any more than I do. They'd hang me as an example to every other plantation wife who might get ideas about justice. Webb shrugged. Perhaps. But that's not really my concern. My concern is the reward money and the reputation. So you have a choice. Come voluntarily, or I bring the sheriff here tonight and you come in chains. Eleanor stared at him. This man who'd tracked her across 3 states for profit and glory, who saw her not as a human being but as a commodity, a means to advancement. He was everything wrong with the world she'd tried to escape. The reduction of human lives to transactions, the belief that power and money justified any action. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until morning, Webb said. After that, I'm going to the authorities whether you agree or not. The only question is how you make this journey. He stepped aside then, finally letting her pass. Eleanor walked down the hallway on legs that felt like water, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same ending. She could run, but Webb would alert every lawman between here and Texas. She could shoot him, but that would only make things worse. She could go back voluntarily and hope for mercy that she knew wouldn't come. Or she could disappear so completely that even a determined bounty hunter couldn't find her. Eleanor worked through the evening in a daze, serving dinner, cleaning dishes, responding to requests with mechanical politeness, while her mind spun through possibilities. Webb sat in the dining room, eating leisurely, his eyes following her movements with proprietary satisfaction. After the evening meal, Eleanor told Madame Bouchard she was feeling unwell and retired early. In her small attic room, she packed her few possessions, the clothes she'd acquired, the books she'd managed to keep, Richard's pistol with its 5 remaining bullets. The money she'd earned was hidden in a false bottom of her bag, enough for maybe a month if she was careful. She waited until the house fell silent, until even the late-night sounds of the river town quieted to whispers. Then she opened her window and looked out at the drop to the alley below. Too far to jump safely, but there was a drainage pipe running down the side of the building. Eleanor had never climbed anything in her life, had been raised to be decorative and marriageable, taught that physical exertion was unladylike and unnecessary. But she'd also spent the last 3 months hauling buckets of water, scrubbing floors, and discovering strengths she never knew she had. She swung her leg over the windowsill. The pipe was slick with recent rain, and colder than she'd expected. Eleanor gripped it with hands that shook from fear and determination, finding footholds in the wooden siding, moving downward with agonizing slowness. Halfway down, her foot slipped and she slid several feet, the pipe burning her palms before she caught herself. She hung there, breathing hard, looking down at the ground that suddenly seemed very far away. Then she thought of Lily, running toward freedom with nothing but hope. Thought of Moses, choosing justice over safety. Thought of the 100 souls who'd fled Willowbrook with nothing but the knowledge that anything was better than bondage. If they could do it, so could she. Eleanor reached the ground with bleeding palms and shaking legs. She moved through the alleys of Natchitoches like a ghost, avoiding the main streets where late-night stragglers might see and remember her. The river called to her. Water meant transport, escape, a highway that could carry her away. The docks were quiet at this hour, just a few boats tied up, their owners sleeping aboard or in town. Eleanor studied them, looking for something small enough for one person, seaworthy enough to survive the river's currents. Her eyes settled on a flat-bottomed skiff, the kind used for fishing, with a single oar and a canvas covering. Stealing was wrong. Eleanor's moral education had been very clear on that point. But then, her moral education had also suggested that owning human beings was acceptable, so perhaps it wasn't the most reliable guide. She untied the skiff and pushed off into the current. The Red River caught her immediately, pulling the small boat into its flow. Eleanor had never rowed before, but survival was a remarkable teacher. She learned quickly, her movements becoming less frantic and more efficient as she found the rhythm. The current did most of the work, carrying her south and west, deeper into Louisiana, away from Webb and his bounty, and his certainty that she was nothing but a means to profit. She rode through the night, her blistered hands screaming protest, her arms burning with effort. Behind her, Natchitoches disappeared into darkness. Ahead, the river stretched endlessly, bordered by cypress and willow, alive with sounds she couldn't identify, but found oddly comforting. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor finally let herself rest. She was miles from the boarding house, miles from Harrison Webb, floating on a river that had carried runaway slaves to freedom for decades. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become what she'd helped others become, a fugitive seeking redemption in motion. The skiff drifted past a small settlement, just a few houses and a dock. Eleanor considered stopping, but something made her continue. She wasn't ready yet to become someone new, to craft another false identity and hope it held. She needed more distance, more time, more river between her and everything she'd been. Around midday, exhausted beyond bearing, Eleanor guided the skiff to a secluded bank overhung with moss-draped trees. She pulled it partially onto land, covered herself with the canvas, and fell into sleep so deep it felt like death. She woke to voices. Eleanor froze under the canvas, her hand instinctively moving toward the pistol. Through a gap in the covering, she could see figures on the bank. 2 men, 1 woman, all of them black, all of them moving with the cautious speed of people who couldn't afford to be seen. "Said the river was safest," one of the men was saying. "Said if we follow it west to where it meets the Mississippi, there's people who can help." "If the patrollers don't catch us first," the woman replied. Her voice was young, frightened, determined. "If we don't starve, if we don't—" She stopped abruptly, staring at the skiff, at Eleanor's boat, which she'd hidden so poorly in her exhaustion. The 3 of them froze. Eleanor knew she should stay hidden, should wait for them to move on, should protect her own escape before worrying about anyone else's. But she found herself pulling back the canvas, sitting up, meeting their terrified eyes. "You're running," Eleanor said quietly. It wasn't a question. The older man stepped protectively in front of the woman. "We don't want no trouble, ma'am. We'll just be moving on." "From where?" Eleanor asked. "What plantation?" They exchanged glances, weighing whether honesty or silence was more dangerous. Finally, the woman spoke. "Beaumont Estate, 3 days north. Master Beaumont, he was going to sell my baby, my 3-month-old baby, so we ran." Eleanor looked at them, this small, desperate group carrying almost nothing, fleeing toward uncertainty because the certainty they had was unbearable. She thought of the 100 people who'd fled Willowbrook, thought of Lily and Moses and all the others she'd helped free, thought of the promise she'd made to herself that night on the veranda, that silence made you complicit, and she was done being silent. "Get in," she said, gesturing to the skiff. They stared at her. "Ma'am." "Get in the boat. It's not big enough for all of us comfortably, but it'll work. I'm heading west anyway. Might as well have company." "You'd help us?" The woman's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're white. You could turn us in, collect reward money." "I could," Eleanor agreed, "but I'm running from bounty hunters myself, so it seems we have common cause." She smiled grimly. "Besides, I'm getting tired of being alone with my own thoughts. They're not particularly good company." It took more convincing, but finally they climbed aboard. The 2 men, whose names were Samuel and Thomas, and the woman, whose name was Mary, and whose baby was wrapped so carefully against her chest that Eleanor hadn't even seen him until they were in the boat together. They pushed off into the current again, 4 fugitives in a stolen skiff, heading toward a freedom that might not exist but was still worth dying for. As they traveled, they talked. Mary told her story, how she'd been born at Beaumont, how she'd met Samuel in the fields, how they'd married with no legal sanction, but every emotional truth. how Master Beaumont had decided her baby would fetch a good price in New Orleans and had announced the sale as casually as he might announce the weather. Samuel spoke of beatings, of watching his brother sold away when they were children, of the slow accumulation of injustices that eventually weighed more than fear. Thomas, who turned out to be Mary's brother, described the network of whispered information that connected plantations, coded songs, secret meetings, the underground railroad that existed in fragments and hope. And Eleanor slowly told them about Willowbrook, about Richard and what she'd done, about Lily and Moses and the long night that had ended with her husband dead and over 100 people free. They listened in stunned silence. When she finished, Mary was crying. "You gave up everything," the young woman whispered, "your whole life, for people who weren't even yours." "They were never his to own," Eleanor said simply. "Just like you're not Beaumont's, just like no one should belong to anyone else." They traveled for 3 more days, the skiff carrying them deeper into Louisiana's labyrinth of waterways. They ate sparingly from supplies Samuel had managed to steal: hard bread, dried meat, water from the river that tasted of earth and fish. They took turns rowing, took turns keeping watch, took turns holding Mary's baby so she could rest. On the 4th night, as they camped on a muddy bank beneath stars that seemed impossibly bright, Samuel asked the question Eleanor had been dreading. "What happens to you, Mrs.? What should we call you?" "Ellen," Eleanor said. "Just Ellen. And I don't know what happens to me. I suppose I keep running until I find somewhere I can stop, or until they catch me." "Moo, come with us," Mary said suddenly. "Come north. The people Thomas heard about, the ones who help folks like us, they help white folks running from the law too. You could disappear into the Free States, start over proper." Eleanor considered it. The idea of disappearing into the north, of finding a place where her past couldn't reach her, was tempting. But she thought of Harrison Webb, probably already spreading word of her whereabouts. Thought of how distinctive she was. A white woman traveling with runaway slaves would be remembered, questioned, reported. "I'd put you in danger," she said finally. "A white woman with a group of runaways? That's too noticeable. You need to move fast and invisible. I'd make you visible." "So what then?" Samuel pressed. "You just drift until they catch you." Eleanor looked out at the river, at the way it caught starlight and held it, at the way it kept moving no matter what. And she thought of the slaves who'd fled Willowbrook, scattering in every direction, making it impossible for the patrols to track them all. "I have an idea," she said slowly. "It's probably insane, but then everything I've done for the last 3 months has been insane, so why stop now?" She told them her plan. They argued, tried to talk her out of it, called her crazy and brave and suicidal, but in the end they understood. Sometimes the only way forward was through the thing you feared most. The next morning they parted ways. Samuel, Mary, Thomas and the baby continued north in the skiff, heading toward the network of safe houses and sympathetic souls that might carry them to freedom. Eleanor gave them what money she could spare and Richard's pistol over their protests. "You need it more than I do," she said. "Where I'm going, a gun won't help me." She watched them disappear around a bend in the river, 3 adults and a baby who deserved better than the world had given them. Then she turned west, toward Texas, toward a gamble that would either save her or destroy her completely. Eleanor Carter was going to find Lily. The Texas territories in 1860 were a strange patchwork of civilization and wilderness, places where the future seemed to be negotiating with the past over who would win. Eleanor traveled through landscapes that shifted from piney woods to open prairie, through settlements that ranged from established towns to collections of tents and hope. She'd sold what little jewelry she had left in a place called Henderson, trading gold and garnets for practical supplies, men's clothing that would last longer and attract less attention, a horse that was old but steady, provisions that would see her through weeks of travel. The storekeeper had looked at her strangely, this solitary woman buying equipment for rough country, But Texas was full of strange people doing strange things, and he'd taken her money without questions. Eleanor had one clue to follow, one fragment of information gleaned from conversations overheard in boarding houses and trading posts. There was a settlement, people said, somewhere in the eastern Texas territories near the Louisiana border, a place where freed slaves had gathered, building farms and lives from scratch. The locals called it different things: Freedom's Point, New Hope, or sometimes just that place where the runaways went. The authorities knew about it, of course. But Texas was vast and understaffed, and the settlement was isolated enough that raiding it seemed more trouble than it was worth. Besides, many Texans had complicated feelings about slavery. Some plantations in the eastern part of the territory practiced it, but the wider, wilder regions tended toward more egalitarian arrangements, born of necessity and danger. Eleanor searched for weeks, following rumors and whispers, riding through country that was beautiful and harsh in equal measure. She slept rough, learned to start fires without kindling, discovered she could endure far more than she'd believed possible. The woman who'd once needed servants to dress her was gone. In her place was someone harder, stranger, more her own than she'd ever been as Eleanor Carter. She found the settlement on a grey afternoon in December, when the sky threatened rain and the temperature had dropped enough that her breath came in visible puffs. It wasn't much to look at, maybe 30 structures ranging from log cabins to tents, fields that had been cleared and planted, livestock pens holding pigs and chickens, a central area with what looked like a communal fire pit and meeting space. But what struck Eleanor immediately was the life in it. Children playing, people working, voices calling to each other without fear. The atmosphere was one of guarded hope, of people who'd grabbed freedom with both hands and weren't letting go. She rode in slowly, hands visible, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. People stopped what they were doing, watched her approach. A group of men moved toward her, positioning themselves between Eleanor and the heart of the settlement. The man who stepped forward was old, his hair completely white, his face a map of experiences Eleanor couldn't imagine. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "You lost, ma'am?" "I'm looking for someone," Eleanor said. "A girl named Lily. She would have come here from Mississippi, probably around August or September, maybe with a group of others from Willowbrook Plantation." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Hands moved toward tools that could double as weapons. The old man's expression became carefully neutral. "Don't know anyone by that name," he said. "Don't know anything about Willowbrook either. Maybe you got the wrong place." "Please," Eleanor said, and she heard the desperation in her own voice. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not a bounty hunter or a slave catcher. I just need to find her, to know she's all right." "Why?" Another voice, younger, challenging. "Why would a white woman ride all the way out here looking for a runaway slave unless she planned to take her back?" Eleanor dismounted slowly, keeping her movements measured. She met the old man's eyes directly. "Because I'm the one who helped her escape. Because I'm the reason she's free. And because I need to know that what I did mattered, that she made it." Silence fell over the group. The old man studied her face for a long moment, and Eleanor felt like he was reading her entire history, weighing her soul against some standard she couldn't see. Finally, he spoke. "You got a name?" Eleanor Carter, but I've been going by Ellen Moore." The reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A woman gasped. And then, from behind the line of protective men, a voice that made Eleanor's heart stop. "Let her through." The crowd parted, and there was Lily. She looked different, older somehow, despite only a few months passing. Her hair was wrapped in a colourful scarf. Her dress was simple but clean, and she carried herself with a confidence Eleanor had never seen in her before. But her eyes were the same, intelligent, watchful, alive with recognition. "Lily," Eleanor breathed. The girl moved forward, studying Eleanor with an expression too complex to read. When she spoke, her voice was measured, careful. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again, Mom. Thought you'd be hanged by now, or living quiet somewhere pretending none of it ever happened." "I tried the latter," Eleanor admitted. "Didn't take. A bounty hunter found me in Louisiana. I've been running ever since." Lily nodded slowly, then turned to the old man. "She's telling the truth, Ezra. This is the woman I told you about, the one who gave us the keys, the one who locked her husband in with us and walked away." Ezra's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complicated. "You're her, the one from the stories." He studied Eleanor with new intensity. "Moses told us what happened that night, what you did, what you sacrificed." "Moses is here," Eleanor's voice cracked with unexpected emotion. "He made it." "Most of us made it," Lily said quietly. "Lost a few along the way. 2 got caught in Arkansas, sent back. 1 died of fever on the journey. But 63 of us from Willowbrook are here now, building something new." Eleanor felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free. "I'm so glad. I'm so—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words adequate to the relief flooding through her. "Come on," Lily said, and her voice softened slightly. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in weeks. Let's get you food, and you can tell us how you ended up here." The settlement's central building was a large log structure that served as meeting hall, dining area, and community center. Inside, Eleanor found herself surrounded by faces she recognized from Willowbrook. People who'd lived in those quarters, who'd worked those fields, who'd survived Richard Carter's cruelty and somehow made it to this unlikely refuge. Moses was there, sitting at a rough wooden table, and when he saw Eleanor, his face broke into a smile that transformed his features. "Mrs. Carter, never thought I'd be pleased to see you again, but here we are, just Eleanor," she said, sitting across from him. "Or Ellen. I gave up being a Carter the night I left Willowbrook. Someone brought her food, cornbread and beans and coffee that tasted better than anything she'd had in months." As she ate, Eleanor told them everything. Harrison Webb and his bounty, the escape from Natchitoches, the encounter with Mary, Samuel and Thomas on the river, her decision to find them rather than disappear north. When she finished, Moses leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "You're either the bravest white woman I ever met or the most foolish, maybe both." "Definitely both," Eleanor said with a weak smile. "But I couldn't just run. I needed to know that what happened at Willowbrook meant something. That you were building lives, not just surviving. We're building," Lily said firmly. She'd sat down beside Eleanor, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "We got fields planted for next season. Got a schoolhouse going where I teach reading, using everything you taught me and then some. Got families staying together, children growing up free. It ain't easy, and it ain't safe, but it's ours." "The authorities know you're here," Eleanor said. "Aren't you worried about raids?" Ezra, who joined them at the table, shrugged. "They know we're here, but raiding us would be complicated. We're on territory that ain't quite Louisiana, ain't quite Texas, technically part of the Republic, but far enough from any real law that nobody wants to bother. Plus, we got allies, local farmers who trade with us, a few abolitionists who send supplies, even some white folks who just believe people ought to be left alone to live how they choose. And if they do come, we got lookouts, we got plans, we scatter into the woods and reassemble after they leave. It ain't perfect, but nothing is." Moses fixed Eleanor with a serious look. "But that ain't your worry anymore. Question is, what are you planning to do? You can't stay here." "Why not?" The words came out before Eleanor could stop them. The table fell silent. Lily and Moses exchanged glances. Finally, Ezra spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Because you're white, ma'am. And having a white woman here puts everyone at risk. If the authorities come looking and find you with us, it gives them legal justification to raid this place properly. Makes us look like we're harboring fugitives instead of just being free people making a life." "I am a fugitive," Eleanor pointed out. "A white fugitive is different than a black one in the eyes of the law," Moses said bluntly. "You know that as well as we do." We can't protect you here, and you being here might destroy what we've built." Eleanor knew they were right, had known it even before she arrived, but hearing it spoken aloud still hurt. "Then what should I do? Where should I go?" "North," Lily said immediately. "Canada, if you can make it. Somewhere the bounty hunters can't follow and the story of Willowbrook won't reach. You could start over, become someone new, actually live." "I don't want to start over," Eleanor said, and she was surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "I don't want to pretend it never happened. What we did at Willowbrook, that matters. It should matter. Running and hiding and lying about who I am, that feels like betraying it all." "So what then?" Moses asked. "You want to turn yourself in, face a trial you can't win and a hanging that's guaranteed? That serve justice somehow?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if answers might be floating in its dark surface. Finally, she spoke. "What if I told the story? What if instead of running or hiding, I made sure people knew the truth about places like Willowbrook, about men like Richard Carter and the system that created them?" "You'd be signing your death warrant," Ezra said flatly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'd be doing something that actually matters. There are abolitionists in the North, newspapers that print their views. What if I gave them testimony? What if I told them everything? Not just about that night, but about years of watching slavery destroy people, about the economic system built on human misery, about how the whole structure depends on women, like I was staying silent?" Lily grabbed her hand. "Eleanor, that's suicide. They'd hunt you down before you published a single word." "Maybe," Eleanor repeated, "but maybe not. And even if they did, at least I'd die having said something that mattered instead of just disappearing." The group around the table argued with her for hours. They told her she was being foolish, suicidal, that individual martyrdom wouldn't change a system this entrenched. They offered her money, supplies, directions to safe houses on the Underground Railroad that could spirit her to Canada. But Eleanor had spent 7 years being practical, being silent, being complicit. She'd spent 3 months running, becoming less herself with each new lie and false name. She was tired of survival without purpose. "I need to go back," she said finally, and the words felt like both a death sentence and a liberation. "Not to Mississippi, that would be pointless, but to somewhere I can make this matter. New Orleans maybe, or Memphis. Somewhere with newspapers, with abolitionists who'll listen, with a stage large enough that my voice might carry." "Ah, you're determined?" Moses asked, and his expression was sad but understanding. "I am." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll help you. Give you what supplies we can, what money we've managed to save. But Eleanor, when you tell this story, you tell all of it. You tell about your husband's cruelty, yes, but you also tell about how we took that cruelty and answered it. How we claimed justice with our own hands when the law wouldn't give it. You tell the truth, even the parts that scare white folks. Especially those parts." "I will," Eleanor promised. "I'll tell it all." They gave her 3 days in the settlement, 3 days to rest, to regain her strength, to prepare for what came next. Lily showed her the school, the fields, the homes people had built with their own hands. Eleanor met families, learned names, heard stories of escapes and reunions and losses and hopes. She met a woman named Sarah who'd been sold away from her children at 12 and had walked 500 miles to find them again, succeeding against impossible odds. She met a man named Jacob who'd taught himself blacksmithing and now made tools for the entire settlement. She met children who'd been born into slavery but were growing up free, their futures unwritten and therefore full of possibility. On her last night, they held a gathering. People shared food they'd grown themselves, sang songs that had sustained them through darkness, told stories that wove their individual experiences into a collective history. Eleanor sat and listened, understanding that she was witnessing something precious and rare, people creating culture, creating community, creating freedom from raw materials of survival and hope. Lily sat beside her through it all. As the night deepened and the fire burned down to embers, the girl spoke quietly. "I'm scared for you. What you're planning, it's going to get you killed." "Probably," Eleanor agreed. "But Lily, I've been dead for years. From the moment I married Richard, I started dying. The night at Willowbrook was the first time I felt alive, and these last months running, hiding, lying, that's just a different kind of death. At least this way, I die, meaning something." "You already mean something," Lily said fiercely. "You mean something to me, to all of us. You don't have to martyr yourself to matter." Eleanor turned to look at the girl she'd taught to read, the young woman who'd survived Richard's attentions and Eleanor's revolution and a 500-mile journey to freedom. "What will you do? After I'm gone, what will you become?" Lily smiled, and it was radiant. "I'm going to teach, going to make sure every child in this settlement learns to read and write and know their own worth. Going to help build something that lasts. And someday, when slavery's ended, because it will end, has to end, I'm going to tell people about a white woman who chose justice over comfort, who gave up everything to do one right thing." "Make sure they know it wasn't heroic," Eleanor said. "Make sure they know I spent years being complicit, that I only acted when it became personal, that I don't deserve to be remembered as anything but complicated and flawed." "I'll tell the truth," Lily promised. "Same as you're going to do." They sat together as the fire died and the settlement settled into sleep. Around them, freed people dreamed freed people's dreams. And Eleanor Carter, who'd been born into privilege and married into horror, who'd been silent and then explosive and then fugitive, felt something like peace. In the morning they gave her supplies, money, and a horse better than the one she'd arrived with. Moses drew her a map showing routes to Memphis, marking safe places and danger zones. Ezra gave her the names of contacts, abolitionists, sympathetic newspaper editors, people who might help her tell her story before the law caught up with her. Lily gave her a letter, sealed and addressed to William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist editor. "I wrote down everything that happened at Willowbrook, everything you did, everything we did. If you don't make it to tell your story, maybe this will tell it for you." And Eleanor tucked the letter into her saddlebag, next to her few possessions and the journal she'd started keeping. She embraced Lily, held the girl close, memorizing this moment because she knew it would be their last. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, "for surviving, for thriving, for making everything that happened mean something." "Thank you," Lily replied, "for being brave when it mattered most." Eleanor mounted her horse and rode out of the settlement as the sun rose, heading east toward Memphis and whatever awaited her there. Behind her, the people of Freedom's Point returned to their lives, their farming, their building, their determined creation of futures they'd been told they couldn't have. She didn't look back. Forward was the only direction that made sense anymore. Eleanor reached Memphis in early January of 1860, when the city was grey with winter and tense with political anxiety. The presidential election was approaching, and the question of slavery had transformed from debate into something approaching national psychosis. The South was threatening secession if an abolitionist president was elected. The North was increasingly divided between those who wanted immediate emancipation and those who preferred gradual solutions or outright maintenance of the status quo. Into this powder keg, Eleanor Carter rode with a story that would horrify everyone. She checked into a modest boarding house under her real name. No more false identities, no more hiding. If she was going to tell the truth, she would start with her own identity. The landlady, a stern German woman named Mrs. Hoffman, looked at her registration with raised eyebrows. "Carter? Any relation to the Mississippi Carters?" "I'm Richard Carter's widow," Eleanor said calmly. "The one from Willowbrook Plantation." Mrs. Hoffman's eyes widened. "The woman who disappeared. They say you helped murder your husband." "They're right," Eleanor said, "and I'm here to explain why." Within hours, Word had spread through Memphis that Eleanor Carter, the fugitive from Mississippi, the woman connected to one of the most shocking crimes in recent Southern history, was in the city and willing to talk. By evening, her boarding house was surrounded by journalists, curiosity seekers, and a notable absence of law enforcement. The absence intrigued Eleanor until Mrs. Hoffman explained it. Memphis police chief is a complicated man. Got abolitionist sympathies but has to enforce the law. Word is, he's deciding whether arresting you causes more trouble than it solves. In the meantime, he's looking the other way. It was a temporary reprieve, Eleanor knew, but temporary was all she needed. She gave her first interview to a journalist named Benjamin Hart, who worked for a northern newspaper with abolitionist leanings. He sat across from her in Mrs. Hoffman's parlor, notebook open, expression skeptical. "Why should I believe anything you say?" he asked bluntly. "You could be making up any story to justify murder." "You shouldn't believe me," Eleanor said. "You should investigate. Go to Willowbrook, talk to the slaves who remained, find the people who fled and interview them. Get testimony from neighbors who knew Richard, from overseers who worked for him, from anyone connected to that plantation. Then decide if my story matches the evidence." Hart's skepticism wavered slightly. "What exactly is your story?" Eleanor took a deep breath and began. She told him everything. About marrying Richard, about 7 years of watching slavery's daily atrocities, about the moment when Richard threatened Lily and something inside Eleanor finally broke. She described the night of the revolt, the decision to lock Richard in the quarters, the sounds that followed. She didn't flinch from the horror of it, didn't try to make it prettier or more palatable. She told Hart that she'd essentially sentenced her husband to death by mob violence, and she told him why she'd felt it was justified. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said. "I'm asking for understanding. I'm asking people to see that the system that created Richard Carter, that gave him absolute power over other human beings, that taught him he could buy and sell and brutalize people without consequence, that system is the real crime. What happened that night was brutal and wrong, but it was a response to years of brutality and wrongness that society called legal and acceptable." Hart wrote furiously, his skepticism transforming into horrified fascination. When Eleanor finished, he sat back and studied her. "You know they'll hang you for this. You're confessing to capital crimes." "I know. And you're doing it anyway?" "I am." "Oh, why?" Eleanor thought about Lily, teaching children to read in a settlement built from hope and determination, thought about Moses and his quiet dignity, thought about Mary and her baby, heading north toward freedom that might kill them but was still worth pursuing, thought about all the people still enslaved, still suffering, still waiting for a society that refused to acknowledge their humanity. "Because silence is complicity," she said simply. "And I'm done being complicit." Hart published the interview 3 days later. It was picked up by abolitionist papers across the North, reprinted in full or in excerpts, discussed in parlors and churches and meeting halls. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Abolitionists hailed Eleanor as a hero, a white woman who'd chosen justice over comfort and was now martyring herself to expose slavery's horrors. They organized rallies in her support, wrote editorials praising her courage, and began using her story as evidence that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, even privileged white women. The Southern response was apoplectic. Eleanor was called a traitor, a murderer, an insane woman who'd betrayed her race and class. Mississippi formally demanded her extradition. Newspapers ran editorials calling for her immediate hanging. Death threats arrived daily at Mrs. Hoffman's boarding house, describing in graphic detail what should be done to Eleanor for her crimes. More journalists came. Eleanor gave interview after interview, each one expanding on different aspects of her story. She described the economics of slavery, the casual cruelty it engendered, the way it warped both enslaved and enslaver into terrible parodies of humanity. She named names: other plantation owners, politicians who defended the institution, businessmen who profited from it. She made herself a target, and she did it deliberately. 2 weeks after Hart's article, a delegation of Southern businessmen arrived at the boarding house, demanding to speak with Eleanor. Mrs. Hoffman tried to turn them away, but Eleanor agreed to see them. There were 5 of them, dressed in expensive suits, carrying themselves with the assurance of men accustomed to power. Their spokesman was a silver-haired man named Douglas Fenwick, who owned 3 plantations and sat on Mississippi's state legislature. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "you've caused quite a stir." "Good," Eleanor replied. Fenwick's smile tightened. "You're making yourself and your former social class look very bad. You're giving ammunition to radicals who want to destroy the Southern way of life." "The Southern way of life is built on stolen labor and human misery. It should be destroyed." "Careful, madam. You're already wanted for murder. Adding sedition to your crimes won't help your case." Eleanor leaned forward. "Mr. Fenwick, I'm going to hang. We both know that. The only question is whether I hang having said nothing or having said everything. I've chosen everything. So you can threaten me, bribe me, or plead with me, but you can't silence me. That ship sailed the night I locked Richard in the quarters." Fenwick's facade cracked. "You're a fool. You think your testimony will change anything. Slavery is the foundation of our economy, protected by law and constitution. One hysterical woman's story won't topple that." "Maybe not," Eleanor agreed, "but maybe it'll make people think. Maybe it'll plant seeds. Maybe it'll be one more crack in a foundation that's already rotting from within. And maybe, decades from now, someone will read about what I did and understand that silence was never acceptable." The delegation left, but Eleanor knew they wouldn't give up. Men like Fenwick had too much invested in maintaining the status quo. They'd find a way to silence her, either through legal channels or less legal ones. She was right. 3 days later, Memphis police chief finally buckled under pressure from Mississippi authorities and arrested Eleanor. She was charged with conspiracy to murder, aiding fugitive slaves, destruction of property, and 6 other crimes that added up to certain execution. The trial was set for March in Jackson, Mississippi. Eleanor would be taken back to the state where her crimes occurred, tried before a jury of men who owned slaves, and almost certainly sentenced to death. She had 2 months to live, maybe less. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. From her jail cell in Memphis, she continued giving interviews. Journalists came daily, taking down her words, publishing her testimony. She wrote essays describing slavery's daily operations, the way it brutalized everyone involved, the moral rot at its core. She corresponded with abolitionists, encouraging them to use her story to make her martyrdom mean something. And she wrote letters to newspapers, to politicians, to clergymen, to anyone who might listen. In them, she asked a simple question, as if slavery was truly moral and right, why did it require such violence to maintain? Why did enslaved people run when given the chance? Why did masters need whips and chains and terror to keep people working? The letters were published widely. They became talking points in the growing national debate. Eleanor Carter, the woman who'd helped kill her husband, became a symbol, to some of northern aggression and racial betrayal, to others of awakening conscience and justified resistance. In late February, a visitor came that Eleanor hadn't expected. Lily walked into the Memphis jail, accompanied by Moses and 2 other men from Freedom's Point. She looked terrified but determined, her hands clutched together, her eyes bright with tears. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor demanded, gripping the bars of her cell. "You're putting yourself at risk. If anyone recognizes you—" "Let them," Lily interrupted. "You think I'm going to let you face this alone? You think any of us are?" She gestured to Moses and the others. "We came to testify, to tell the court exactly what Richard Carter was, what he did, what you did to stop him." Eleanor felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally break free. "They won't let you testify. You're black, and in Mississippi, your testimony doesn't count in court." "Then we'll testify in the newspapers," Moses said firmly. "We'll tell every journalist who'll listen exactly what happened at Willowbrook. We'll make sure people know the truth, even if the court won't hear it." And they did. Over the next week, Lily, Moses, and the others gave interviews describing their experiences at Willowbrook. They told of beatings, of families separated, of children sold, of a system designed to break human spirits. They described Richard Carter not as Eleanor had, as a husband and criminal, but as a slave owner who was typical rather than exceptional, whose cruelties were normal rather than aberrant. They described the night of his death not as murder, but as execution, as justice delivered by those the law wouldn't protect. Their testimony created a firestorm. Southern papers denounced them as liars and criminals. Northern papers ran their words alongside Eleanor's, creating a comprehensive picture of slavery's horrors. The trial, scheduled for March 15th, became the most anticipated legal proceeding in the country. Eleanor spent her last weeks in Memphis reading letters from people across the nation. Some called her a saint, others a demon. Some told her they'd been inspired to join the abolitionist movement, others that they hoped she burned in hell. She read them all with equal attention, understanding that she'd become less a person and more a symbol, a flashpoint for conflicts that had been brewing since the nation's founding. On March 10th, 5 days before her trial, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Harrison Webb, the bounty hunter who'd found her in Louisiana, stood outside her cell. He looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by something more uncertain. "I thought you'd be pleased," Eleanor said. "You're getting your reward money after all." Webb shook his head. "Haven't claimed it, probably won't." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because I've been reading the interviews. Yours, the ones from the people you helped. And I've been thinking about what I do, hunting people for money, thinking about whether that's the kind of man I want to be." He met her eyes. "You made me look at myself, Mrs. Carter, and I don't like what I saw." "So what now?" "Now I'm heading to California. Gonna find different work, maybe something that doesn't involve tracking human beings like animals." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that. Wanted you to know that whatever happens at your trial, you changed at least one person's mind about how things should be." After he left, Eleanor sat in her cell and cried, not from sadness or fear, but from something like hope. Maybe she had made a difference. Maybe her choices, her testimony, her willingness to face consequences rather than flee them, maybe all of it meant something. The journey to Jackson began on March 12th. Eleanor was transported in a prison wagon, accompanied by armed guards and watched by crowds at every stop. Some people threw flowers, others rocks. Some prayed for her, others cursed her. She was a mirror that reflected whatever people already believed about slavery, justice, and the price of moral stands. Lily and Moses tried to follow, but authorities barred them from Mississippi. The last Eleanor saw of them was at the state line, 2 figures standing beside the road, hands raised in farewell or solidarity or prayer. The trial itself was a foregone conclusion. Eleanor was allowed to testify, to tell her story, but the all-male, all-white, all-slave-holding jury listened with expressions of stone. Her lawyer, a young abolitionist from New York who'd volunteered to defend her, tried to argue temporary insanity, duress, any mitigating circumstance that might save her life. But Eleanor wouldn't let him. "I'm not insane," she told the court clearly. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I understood the consequences. And I'd do it again, because what my husband did to those people was evil. And the system that protected him was evil. And sometimes the only response to evil is resistance, even when resistance means breaking the law." The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to hang on April 1st, 1860. Eleanor had 3 weeks to live. She spent them writing letters to newspapers, essays about slavery and justice, a long letter to Lily telling her to keep teaching, to keep building, to never stop fighting for a world where what happened at Willowbrook could never happen again. On the evening of March 31st, her last night alive, Eleanor sat in her cell and thought about the strange arc her life had taken, from privileged girl to plantation wife to revolutionary to fugitive to martyr. She thought about Richard and felt no guilt for his death, only relief that he could hurt no one else. She thought about the 100 people who'd fled Willowbrook and wondered where they were now, whether they'd found freedom or just different forms of bondage. She thought about Lily, bright and fierce, building a future one lesson at a time. And she thought about the country itself, this nation built on beautiful words about freedom and equality while simultaneously enslaving millions. She wondered if it would survive the contradictions or if the violence she'd participated in at Willowbrook was a preview of violence to come. On April 1st, 1860, Eleanor Carter was led from her cell to the gallows erected in Jackson's town square. Thousands had gathered, some to celebrate her execution, others to mourn it. She wore a simple grey dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression calm. She was allowed final words. Eleanor stood on the platform, looking out at the sea of faces, and spoke clearly. "I'm being executed for helping enslaved people kill their master. The law says that's murder. But I say the real murder happens every day on plantations across this nation, where human beings are worked to death, beaten, raped, sold, and destroyed by a system that calls itself civilized. I regret nothing I did at Willowbrook. I only regret that I didn't act sooner, that I was silent for so long, that I needed it to become personal before I found my courage. If my death makes even one person question slavery, makes one person speak up who was silent, makes one person choose justice over comfort, then it's worth it. And to those still enslaved, your freedom is coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's coming. Hold on, resist, survive. And remember that not everyone who looked like your masters agreed with them." The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Eleanor closed her eyes and thought of Lily's smile, of Moses's dignity, of Mary's baby who deserved a better world. She thought of the moment she'd stood on Willowbrook's veranda and decided that silence was no longer acceptable. The trapdoor opened. Eleanor Carter died on April 1st, 1860. At the age of 26.